in my plans, it calls for putting a 3mm carbon fiber tube on the elevator, because with airplanes like this you have a really thin section of the elevator so it fits inside the fuselage, so that's really flexible and it'll just break. So you can put a carbon tube in it, but another thing I've found that you can do, which I've found to work pretty well, is use a piece of stiff wire like this. I bent it into a shape, kind of a U-shaped part, and then you can put it in your stick it on your elevator like that to prevent twisting. I think just kind of. So what I did was I stuck it on there, lined it up, then went around and pressed it down really hard to leave kind of a groove that you probably can hardly even see on this. So I'm going to press it down real hard on this to leave a groove so you can kind of tell where it is. And then take a toothpick and kind of make the groove bigger so that your wire sits a little bit more flush. I took the end of a pencil with no lead on it and then took it and went around the groove to make it a little deeper. You can kind of see it. So the groove goes down there and up there. So then I can take my wire and then kind of press it into the groove, and then when it's seated into the groove, it sits flush down in the groove. So the next thing you gotta do is you can just glue this wire in. Here we are ready to glue in our piece of wire that goes into the elevator. We already have our slot pre-cut out, so we have our slot in here. And we're going to glue it in with CA glue, which stands for cyanoacrylate. This glue it's the best stuff to use when gluing foam. It's basically like super glue. This stuff dries in about 10 minutes or so, or you could dry it instantly when you spray the glue with this stuff. Instaset, accelerator, or kicker. CA, it's either foam safe or it's not foam safe. This stuff is foam safe. It says foam safe on it. This stuff says foam safe on it. If it doesn't say foam safe on it, it'll melt your foam, so don't use it. So once you got your foam safe CA, preferably in gap filling or thick, because thin just doesn't work very well for foam. So what I'm going to do is take my CA. I'm going to start in the middle of the rod or so. I'm just going to make about like a 1 inch or 1.5 inch strip of glue in there. Then hold the rod down. Then I'm going to take my accelerator or kicker, as everyone calls it, and just spray it. And hold it there for a few seconds. There we go. It's all glued in. So now I glued in a little section about this wide, and for the rest what I'm going to do is kind of go along the side, putting a thin bead around there, kind of fill up the groove. Now with CA, don't touch it, because you can glue your fingers together just like any super glue. So don't hold me responsible if you glue your fingers together or something. I'm going to take this saw and just hold down the tip and spray it like that. So I could hold it down, but I didn't glue my fingers to it. Any hobby store most likely carry CA glue. The only time you would really use thin, the only time I use thin, is when I'm gluing balsa wood together, because the thin CA just soaks right into the balsa wood and it gives you a great bond. There. Now our elevator piece has been glued in like that. It's a lot stiffer and it's flush. So the next thing to do is wherever we had to cut our parts in half to fit on the foam, we gotta glue those back together. So here's our fuselage where we had to cut it in half to make it fit on the foam. It should fit together pretty well. And what you're gonna do is get your CA and your kicker. You're gonna hold it together and then run a thin amount of CA down the crack. Now make sure you don't glue your part to your table, so I'm not responsible if you glue any foam to your table. Though they do have CA debonder, I've never actually tried it, but I've seen it at the hobby store. I'm just going through putting a really small amount of CA in that crack to get a nice glue joint. And before it soaks down too far, I'm just going to squirt it with kicker. I'm just going to hold this section down and put a thin amount in there. Just a tiny amount, you don't have to overdo it. Okay, now this end is pretty weak, so don't put a lot of stress on it because it will break. But like on the wing where we break it, we'll have a carbon tube running through there. I'm going to take a paper towel and just wipe off any excess kicker once the glue is dried, and set it back down on this end, and just do the exact same thing on the other side with putting a thin amount of a small amount of CA in there. The next step is you got to bevel the foam where your hinges go. And I'll show you what that is in a second. So I would do this with a brand new X-Acto knife on a scrap piece of foam at first. I'm going to line up a straight edge to the edge of my scrap piece of foam. Take my X-Acto knife at a 45-degree angle. And I'm just going to cut right through that. Like that. Make sure you keep your ruler pressed down, and there is your beveled edge. So you get a close-up of that. So it's a 45-degree cut sideways in it. So then you're going to have to do that for all your control surfaces. We're going to have to bevel each side of this line. Take my ruler, place it against the edge of this piece. It's nice and flush. Hold it down really tight. Then I'm going to take my knife at a 45-degree angle, 90, 45. I'm just going to go through it, cutting through the foam all the way through with a brand new X-Acto knife. So it goes through one more time. And actually cut all the way through the foam because I don't want to scrape the table. So then we have that. So then you cut off a little triangle shaped piece, and it's a 45-degree angle on that. Now that you've beveled this edge, you're going to have to do the same thing with this side. Now make sure you bevel it in an opposite direction. So this one goes like this one goes like this. so they're together at one end and apart at the other. So, I take this side, I flipped it over, I'm going to do it the same way.
At a 45-degree angle.
See the bevel there? Flat, and there's a 45-degree cut along there. Now, we take our two halves, stick them together. Now we can bend it. I'm going to have to trim this a little bit to make it fit.
Go to the edge here like this, and trim a tiny bit off so it doesn't bind.
And then we have a nice hinge. You can hinge in this direction, and then you can have it hinge back like this. So we're just going to put tape on that later. So once you've beveled your elevator, your ailerons, and your rudder, and then next step is to sand all your pieces lightly. This step is optional, but I like to do it. Just makes everything look a little bit better. This is 220 grit sandpaper. Anything from about 220 to 400 should work just fine. Don't use anything rougher than 220 or you'll just kind of rip up your foam. So I'm just going to go around it lightly like this. Now our foam looks a little better, a little smoother. Just an optional step, but I like to do it. Just makes your foam look better. And now the next step is to install a carbon tube in your wing.